feed store, gossiping in the same booths at the same diner every Sunday after service. Everybody knew whose truck belonged to whom, whose kids had gotten into trouble in high school and whose hadn't, and, perhaps most importantly for what was about to happen, exactly which families the sheriff's department had spent decades quietly deciding deserved the benefit of the doubt. Wyatt had grown up close enough to a town just like it to recognize the pattern the moment he saw it, though he hadn't expected, driving in that morning with nothing on his mind but fence posts and grocery lists, that he was about to become the exception that finally broke it. His grandmother Ruth had lived on her small property just outside town limits for over 40 years, ever since she and her late husband had bought the land for almost nothing, back when the county still considered it too far from anything worth building near. She kept chickens, tended a garden that produced far more tomatoes than one woman could ever eat alone, and called Wyatt every single Sunday evening regardless of what corner of the world he happened to be operating in, trusting that if he couldn't answer, he would call her back the moment he could. It was one of those Sunday calls, 3 weeks earlier, that had ended with her mentioning, almost as an afterthought, that a section of her back fence had come down in a storm and she hadn't had anyone out to fix it yet. Wyatt's medical leave had given him the perfect excuse to finally make good on the promise he'd been making for years to come: take care of it himself. That promise was about to be tested in a gas station parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon that started out like every other afternoon in Redfern Creek. Wyatt had pulled into the Redfern Fuel and Grocery just after 2 in the afternoon to fill up his truck and grab a bottle of water before finishing the last stretch of road to his grandmother's property. He left the windows cracked for Duke, told him to hold position in the truck bed under the shade of the canopy, and walked inside to pay for gas and grab a few groceries his grandmother had asked for on the phone that morning. It was a 5-minute errand. It should have been nothing more than that. He was standing in the checkout line, second in a line of 3 people, chatting briefly with the cashier about the heat while she rang up a bag of ice and a case of water, when he heard the first sound that didn't belong, a sharp, pained yelp carrying across the parking lot, muffled by the station's glass doors but unmistakable to a man who had spent his whole adult life trained to notice exactly the kind of sound that meant something was badly wrong. The 4 men had arrived at the gas station in a battered flatbed truck about 10 minutes before Wyatt did, though he hadn't paid them any particular attention walking in. Just 4 young men in dusty work clothes, the kind of group you'd see at any gas station in any small town on any given afternoon, loud and restless in the way bored young men often are when they've got nowhere in particular to be. Brett Calloway, the tallest of the 4, had noticed Duke sitting calmly in the bed of Wyatt's truck the moment they pulled in beside it, and something about the dog's size, or maybe just the boredom pressing down on all 4 of them in the afternoon heat, had planted an idea in his head that felt, at the time, like nothing more than harmless fun. "Look at the size of that thing," Brett had said to his friends, grinning, as Wyatt walked into the store without a backward glance. "Bet he wouldn't even bark if you got up close to him." It hadn't started as cruelty. Not exactly. Cole Whitfield had climbed up first just to pet the dog, and Duke, well-trained and patient, had tolerated it without complaint. It was only once Brett decided it would be funnier to rattle the truck bed and startle him, and Duke had let out a low, understandably wary growl in response, that the mood in the group shifted from bored curiosity into something uglier. Being growled at, even mildly, even justifiably, seemed to strike something wounded and petty in Brett Calloway, the particular fragile ego of a man who had never once in his life been told no by anything smaller than himself. Within minutes he'd unclipped the leash from the truck bed, looped it instead around the flatbed's trailer hitch to keep Duke from bolting, and pulled his own truck's tire iron loose just to teach him some respect, as he put it to his friends, none of whom stopped him. Wyatt didn't wait for his change. He was out the door before the cashier had even finished ringing up the person in front of him, moving with the fast, economical stride of a man whose body had learned a long time ago that hesitation costs lives. What he saw in the side lot, past the ice machine and the stack of empty propane tanks, made something cold and absolutely still settle into his chest. 4 men stood in a loose half-circle around his truck. Duke's leash, which Wyatt had clipped to a tie-down ring in the truck bed as a precaution against him jumping out into traffic, had been unclipped and looped instead around the trailer hitch of an old flatbed parked crosswise behind the truck, pulled taut enough that Duke had no more than 3 feet of slack to work with. The dog was on his side in the gravel, his back legs scrambling weakly for purchase, blood matting the fur along his ribs, while the tallest of the 4 men stood over him, holding a length of galvanized pipe he'd apparently pulled from the bed of his own truck. "Hold him still, Cole," the tall man said, laughing, drawing the pipe back for another swing. "Big scary military dog, huh? Don't look so scary now." The man they called Cole had one boot pressed down against Duke's shoulder, pinning him against the gravel, while a third man filmed the whole thing on his phone, grinning the specific, empty grin of someone who had never once in his life expected to be held accountable for anything. The 4th man stood a little apart from the others, arms crossed, not participating but not stopping it either, the way a person stands at the edge of a fire they started and didn't expect to get this big. Wyatt Marsh covered the 60 feet between the store entrance and his truck in under 4 seconds. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't waste breath announcing himself. The tall man with the pipe barely had time to register movement in his peripheral vision before Wyatt's hand closed around his wrist mid-swing, stopping the pipe dead in the air with a grip that felt, to the man holding it, like his arm had been caught in a closing car door. Wyatt twisted the wrist a quarter turn, just enough to make the fingers open on instinct, and the pipe dropped into the gravel with a hollow clatter. "Get your boot off my dog," Wyatt said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Cole, the one with his boot pressed against Duke's shoulder, made the second worst decision of his life and decided to swing a fist at the stranger who'd suddenly appeared between him and his friend. Wyatt didn't step back from it. He stepped into it, catching the punch on his forearm and driving his open palm into the center of Cole's chest hard enough to send him stumbling backward into the flatbed truck's tailgate. The wind knocked clean out of him. The man filming let out a startled curse and lowered his phone, the grin gone from his face entirely, replaced by the particular blank panic of someone realizing, too late, that the situation he'd been enjoying had just changed shape completely. Wyatt knelt beside Duke immediately, running his hands along the dog's ribs, his shoulder, checking for the kind of injury that mattered most, all without ever fully taking his eyes off the 4 men now backing slowly away from him. Duke whimpered softly under his handler's touch but didn't try to move, trusting completely, the way he always had, that Wyatt would tell him what came next. "You have exactly 10 seconds, Wyatt said, still crouched beside his dog, his voice carrying the same flat, unhurried calm that made grown men more nervous than any shout ever could, "to decide whether you're going to stand here and wait for the police, or whether you're going to run and make this so much worse for yourselves." The tall man with the pipe, still cradling his twisted wrist, opened his mouth to say something about private property and trespassing, some half-formed threat about calling his own lawyer, but the words died somewhere in his throat when he finally looked, really looked, at the man kneeling in front of him. There was nothing wild in Wyatt Marsh's expression. No rage, no panic, nothing that looked like it could be provoked into a mistake. Just a level, patient stillness that felt, to 4 grown men standing in a gas station parking lot in the middle of the afternoon, considerably more dangerous than anything they could have imagined when they'd started their afternoon. Looking for something to laugh at. None of them ran. All 4 of them, in the end, simply stood there in a loose, uncertain clump near the flatbed truck, waiting for whatever was going to happen next, because something in the way this stranger moved told each of them, individually and all at once, that running would not actually help. The Redfern County Sheriff's Department sent exactly 1 deputy to the scene, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Deputy Roy Panner, who had grown up 2 streets over from the tall man with the pipe, whose name, it turned out, was Brett Calloway. Deputy Panner's cruiser rolled into the gas station lot with its lights on but no siren, the unhurried arrival of a man who had already decided. somewhere between the dispatch call and the drive over. Exactly how much trouble he intended to let this become. By the time Panna climbed out of his cruiser, Wyatt had already wrapped Duke's ribs in a compression bandage from the small trauma kit he kept behind his truck seat out of old habit, and had photographed the pipe, the leash looped around the flatbed's hitch, and the four men's faces on his own phone with the same methodical care he brought to documenting anything that might later require a chain of evidence. "Afternoon, Brett," Panna said to the tall man first, before he'd so much as glanced at the dog bleeding quietly in the gravel. "What's going on out here?" "This lunatic attacked us for no reason, Roy," Brett Calloway said quickly, cradling his wrist and doing his best to look wounded rather than caught. "We were just messing with his dog a little. Wasn't nothing serious. He came flying out of that store like a madman and about broke my arm." Panna turned toward Wyatt with the practiced, unbothered expression of a man who had smoothed over dozens of situations exactly like this one for people he'd known his whole life. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step over here and let's get this sorted out calm-like. There's a dog bleeding on the ground because your friend there beat him with a pipe," Wyatt said evenly, nodding toward Duke, who lay watching the whole exchange with the same rigid, alert stillness he'd carried through 6 years of active deployments. "There's video of it on that man's phone right there, and there's a witness inside who heard it happening before I ever came outside. I'd like that documented as an animal cruelty complaint, and I'd like Mr. Calloway charged accordingly." "Now, let's not get carried away," Panna said, a note of practiced patience creeping into his voice. The tone of a man used to talking excitable strangers down from making trouble in his town. "Brett here's a good boy. Coaches Little League. I'm sure this was all just some horseplay that got a little out of hand." "Horseplay," Wyatt repeated flatly, "doesn't usually involve a galvanized steel pipe and a dog to be down with 3 feet of slack so he couldn't get away from it." Panna's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the flicker of a man realizing the stranger in front of him wasn't going to be talked out of anything the easy way. "Look, I hear you, but out here we handle things a little different than wherever you're from. Why don't you take your dog, get him looked at, and we'll call this whole thing settled between neighbors." A woman who had been standing near the ice machine the whole time, a heavy-set stranger in her 50s passing through town on her way south, stepped forward hesitantly and cleared her throat. "Deputy, I saw the whole thing through the window. That man hit that dog at least 3 times before this fella came out. It wasn't horseplay. It looked like they meant to really hurt him." Panna glanced at her with the flat, unwelcoming look of a man who wished, quite plainly, that she had simply kept driving through town without stopping for gas at all. "I'll take your statement, ma'am," he said, in a tone that suggested he'd rather not. Wyatt stood up slowly, brushing gravel dust from his knees, and looked at the deputy with the same level, unhurried patience he'd used on Brett Calloway moments earlier. "I am a federal employee reporting a documented criminal act against government property, deputy. My dog is a retired multi-purpose military working canine with a service record. I expect a formal report filed tonight, and I expect these 4 men's names attached to it. If that report doesn't exist by tomorrow morning, I'll be making calls of my own to people who don't answer to whatever understanding you and Mr. Calloway have worked out over the years." Something in the flat certainty of that sentence made Deputy Panna pause, just long enough for the moment to stretch uncomfortably in the Texas heat, before he cleared his throat and pulled out his citation pad with obvious reluctance, writing down names he clearly would rather not have written down at all. What none of the 4 men standing in that parking lot realized, as Panna grudgingly took statements and photographed the scene with visible disinterest, was that the man filming the whole assault on his own phone, a nervous, wiry 20-year-old named Denny Ochoa, had never actually deleted the footage he'd captured before Wyatt intervened. And that footage, uploaded to social media less than 2 hours later by Denny's own younger cousin, who'd seen it sitting untouched in a shared family photo album, was about to make Redfern Creek very briefly and very uncomfortably the most talked-about small town in the entire country. Wyatt drove Duke straight to the only emergency veterinary clinic within 40 miles, a small practice run by a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Louise Fenwick, who took one look at the compression bandage Wyatt had already applied and said quietly that whoever had done this triage clearly knew exactly what they were doing. 2 cracked ribs, she said an hour later, once the x-rays had developed, and some deep bruising along the shoulder where it looks like he took the worst of the impact protecting his side. No internal bleeding that I can see, thank God. He's going to be sore for a few weeks, but he's going to heal. Wyatt sat on the floor of the exam room with Duke's head resting heavy against his knee, running his fingers slowly through the fur along the dog's neck, and didn't say much of anything for a long moment. "He's an old soldier," Wyatt finally said. "Took shrapnel meant for me once, 4 years ago, in a place I'm not allowed to describe to you. Didn't make a sound the whole way to the medic that day either. Just did his job and let me do mine." Dr. Fenwick looked at the scar along Duke's shoulder blade, faded silver-white against the black and tan fur, and then back at the quiet, still man sitting on her exam room floor. "Well, he's got a good man looking out for him now," she said gently. "That counts for something, in my experience. More than most people ever realize." She wrapped Duke's ribs properly, gave Wyatt a course of pain medication measured out carefully for the dog's weight, and sat with him a little longer than the appointment strictly required, the way small-town veterinarians often do when they sense a person needs the company as much as the medical advice. "I've been practicing out here almost 20 years, she said, cleaning her instruments at the counter while Duke rested quietly on a folded blanket. "I've stitched up plenty of animals that got hurt by accident. Farm equipment, other dogs, the occasional car. This is the first time in a long while I've had to treat one that got hurt because somebody thought it would be entertaining." She paused, glancing at Wyatt. "I hope you push this as far as it needs to go, Mr. Marsh. I mean that. Too many things like this get quietly forgotten around here." "I don't forget things easily, ma'am," Wyatt said. "It isn't really in my nature." By the time Wyatt got Duke settled into his grandmother's spare room that evening, propped comfortably on a nest of old quilts with a bowl of water within easy reach, his phone had already begun buzzing with notifications faster than he could silence them. He spent that first night sitting on the floor beside the makeshift bed, rather than in his own room down the hall, the way he had done more times than he could count during deployments, when Duke had come back from an operation carrying an injury that needed watching through the night. He didn't sleep much, listening instead to the slow, careful rhythm of the dog's breathing, checking every hour or so that the compression bandage hadn't shifted, that the pain medication was holding, that nothing about the injury had quietly worsened while everyone else in the house slept soundly. Ruth found him there in the grey hour just before dawn, still sitting upright against the wall, one hand resting lightly on Duke's flank. She didn't say anything at first, just brought him a cup of coffee and sat down in the doorway with one of her own, watching the two of them in the pale early light. "You've done this before, haven't you?" she said eventually. "Sat up all night like this. More times than I'd like to count," Wyatt admitted. "Different room, different country, usually a lot more people shooting at us at the time. But yeah, this part's familiar." "He knows you're here," Ruth said. "Even asleep, I'd bet he knows." Wyatt looked down at Duke, whose ear twitched faintly at the sound of their voices, even though his eyes stayed closed, and thought that his grandmother, who had never once served a day in uniform herself, understood something true about the bond between a soldier and the animal who'd carried half his burdens without ever once being asked to. "He's earned an easy stretch of years," Wyatt said quietly. "After everything he's already given. I intend to make sure he gets it one way or another." Denny Ochoa's cousin had posted the video with the caption, "These grown men beat a defenseless dog behind our gas station today and got away with basically nothing. This isn't okay." By 9 that night, it had 40,000 views. By midnight, it had crossed 400,000, and strangers from states Wyatt had never even visited were tagging the local sheriff's department, demanding to know why Brett Calloway was still walking free. The video's spread caught Redfern Creek entirely off guard. The way a match catches dry summer grass, slow at first, and then all at once impossible to contain. Local news out of the nearest city picked up the story by the following morning, running the footage with the men's faces blurred except for Brett Calloway's, which someone in the newsroom had apparently decided the public deserved to see clearly. By that afternoon, animal rights groups from 3 different states had shared it, and a hashtag, Justice for Duke, was trending in a radius far wider than anyone in that small town had ever imagined their private business reaching. Strangers began calling the gas station directly, asking to speak to whoever had witnessed the attack, until the manager finally posted a handwritten sign on the door asking customers to please stop. This isn't that kind of story. We just sell gas and milk here. A national morning show reached out to Wyatt's grandmother's landline, the only number they could track down, and Ruth answered it herself, politely informing the producer that her grandson wasn't interested in television appearances and had a fence to finish fixing. Veterans organizations across the country picked up the story once word spread that Duke was a retired military working dog, several of them offering to cover any veterinary costs Wyatt might incur, an offer he declined just as politely, insisting the bill was his to carry. A local schoolteacher organized a small vigil outside the town's community center 2 nights after the video broke. Nothing elaborate. Just a few dozen neighbors holding paper lanterns and a hand-painted sign reading, "Get well soon." Duke, a gesture that embarrassed Wyatt more than it comforted him, but that his grandmother, watching from the edge of the crowd, found she couldn't stop smiling about for days afterward. Sheriff Ellis Roan, who had held his office for 19 years without ever facing a serious challenger, found himself fielding calls from reporters he'd never heard of by lunchtime, all of them asking the same uncomfortable question. Why had a documented animal cruelty case, caught on video, resulted in nothing more than a single misdemeanor citation issued reluctantly by a deputy who'd grown up next door to the accused? Sheriff Roan was not by nature a corrupt man in the way some men are corrupt. Greedy, calculating, actively selling favors for cash. He was something quieter and, in its own way, more insidious. A man who had spent 19 years prioritizing the comfort of people he'd known his whole life over the rights of anyone who happened to be passing through, and who had never once had to examine that habit closely enough to recognize it for what it was, until a video with 400,000 views made the examination impossible to avoid any longer. He called Deputy Panner into his office that morning, closed the door, and asked him, in a voice considerably less patient than the one Panner had used in that gas station parking lot the day before, exactly why the report on his desk read like a summary of a schoolyard scuffle instead of what the video plainly showed. "Brett's a good kid, Sheriff," Panner said, though his conviction had visibly thinned overnight. Didn't figure it was worth blowing up his whole life over messing around with somebody's dog. "There are 400,000 people right now watching that dog get hit with a pipe," Roy, Sheriff Roan said, rubbing his temples. "And every single one of them is asking why this department decided a dead ribcage was worth less than Brett Calloway's Little League coaching schedule. Fix this report. Today, before somebody with a badge that outranks mine decides to fix it for us." But fixing a report a full day after it had been filed, once the video had already made its way to lawyers and animal welfare organizations who specialized in exactly this kind of institutional failure, was no longer a matter Sheriff Roan could quietly manage on his own terms. Wyatt Marsh, sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table that same morning with Duke resting carefully beside his chair, had already made a phone call of his own. The call went, as it always did in situations Wyatt judged serious enough to warrant it, through a secure line to a contact he rarely used for anything personal. His voice, when the call connected, dropped into the same flat, procedural cadence he used for operational reports, rather than the gentler tone he reserved for his grandmother or for Duke. "This is Chief Petty Officer Wyatt Marsh," he said. "I'm reporting a documented assault against a retired military working dog under my ownership, along with what appears to be an active pattern of local law enforcement declining to properly charge the individuals responsible due to personal relationships within the department. I have photographic and video evidence. I'm requesting guidance on escalating this through appropriate federal channels, given the animal in question retains a service record with the Department of the Navy. The voice on the other end told him exactly what he expected to hear, that a retired military working dog, even honorably discharged into private ownership, still fell under certain federal protections regarding mistreatment, and that a formal referral to both the Department of Defense's Veterinary Command and the FBI's local field office, given the apparent local corruption angle, was entirely justified. Wyatt thanked the voice on the other end, ended the call, and sat for a long moment at his grandmother's kitchen table, watching Duke's ribs rise and fall in careful, shallow breaths, before he opened his laptop and began compiling every photograph, every timestamp, every detail of the last 24 hours into a file organized with the same unforgiving precision he brought to every operation he'd ever run. His grandmother, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Ruth, who had buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children largely on her own, watched him work from across the table with the particular pride of a woman who had always suspected her grandson was capable of exactly this kind of quiet, relentless competence, even back when he was a scrawny boy who used to follow stray dogs home from school. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "No, ma'am," Wyatt said, not looking up from the screen. "Not this time." Brett Calloway, watching his name spread across the internet attached to a video he could no longer pretend was anything other than exactly what it looked like, made the decision that entitled cornered men so often make when they finally feel the walls closing in. He decided the smartest move was to make the problem disappear rather than answer for it. He spent 2 days stewing over it, his father's auto shop suddenly quieter than usual as regular customers found excuses to take their business elsewhere, his coach position with the Little League team quietly and permanently postponed by a league board that had seen the same video everyone else had. By the 3rd night, humiliation had curdled fully into anger, and anger, in a man like Brett Calloway, had always found its outlet in doing something with his hands rather than sitting still and facing what he'd done. He and Cole Whitfield drove out to Ruth Marsh's property 2 nights after the video went viral, parking their truck a quarter-mile down the county road with the headlights off, the way men do when they've convinced themselves that darkness makes an act less real. Their plan, as clumsy and desperate as everything else they'd done since that afternoon at the gas station, was simple and stupid in equal measure. Slash the tires on Wyatt's truck, spray paint a warning across the barn door, and leave before anyone noticed, hoping the message alone would be enough to make the whole mess quietly go away. "We just need him to back off," Brett muttered to Cole as they crept along the fence line, a can of red spray paint rattling faintly in his jacket pocket. "Scare him a little. Guys like that back off once they realize it ain't worth it." Cole, considerably less confident than he'd been standing over a restrained dog, with his boot pressed into its shoulder, glanced nervously toward the dark farmhouse. "I don't know, man. That guy didn't look like the type who scares." "Everybody scares," Brett said, though his own voice wavered slightly on the word. They had not counted on the fact that Wyatt Marsh, a man who had spent 16 years learning to sleep with one part of his mind permanently alert, had noticed the headlights slow and darken from a full quarter-mile out through his grandmother's bedroom window, and had already stepped quietly onto the back porch with Duke, bandaged ribs and all, limping, and then seemed to run out of any version of that sentence that made sense. "You were just trespassing on federal, adjacent property with intent to intimidate a witness in an active investigation," Wyatt said. "Congratulations. You've just handed the FBI a much easier case than the one they were already building." Both men ran. Wyatt didn't chase them. He didn't need to. He already had their faces, their vehicle, their license plate, and a time-stamped video of the entire encounter, which he forwarded within the hour to the federal contact, who had already begun quietly coordinating the case from 2 states away. He walked back inside afterward, locked the porch door, and sat with Duke on the kitchen floor for a long while, running a slow hand over the dog's bandaged ribs to make sure the short burst of movement hadn't reopened anything. Ruth appeared in her housecoat a few minutes later, having woken to the commotion, and stood in the doorway, watching her grandson and his dog, with an expression that mixed fear and pride in roughly equal measure. "They're going to keep coming at this sideways as long as they think there's a way out of it," Wyatt said quietly, more to himself than to her. "People like that don't stop because they suddenly understand they were wrong. They stop when every door they try turns out to be locked." "Then you make sure every door's locked," Ruth said simply, settling into a kitchen chair across from him. "You were always good at that, even as a boy. Locking down whatever needed locking down and not losing a wink of sleep over it." Wyatt allowed himself something close to a tired smile. "Runs in the family, I think." Special Agent Denise Calhoun of the FBI's Regional Field Office arrived in Redfern Creek 4 days later, driving an unmarked sedan that nonetheless managed to draw every eye on Main Street the moment it rolled to a stop outside the sheriff's department. She was in her 40s, sharp-featured, with the particular patient thoroughness of someone who had spent a career untangling small-town corruption that everyone insisted, right up until the evidence made it impossible, wasn't actually corruption at all. She met with Wyatt first, at his grandmother's kitchen table, reviewing his meticulously organized file with visible approval. "This is more thorough than most of what my own agents hand me," she said, flipping through time-stamped photographs and a written statement formatted with the same clean precision as an operational debrief. "You'd have made a decent investigator, Chief Petty Officer." "I had a good reason to be thorough," Wyatt said simply, glancing toward Duke, who lay dozing in a patch of afternoon sun by the window, his ribs healing steadily under Dr. Fenwick's continued care. Agent Calhoun's investigation moved quickly once it began in earnest, because the trail Brett Calloway and his friends had left behind them was, in the end, remarkably easy to follow for anyone willing to actually follow it. It turned out that Brett Calloway's cruelty toward Duke hadn't been an isolated incident at all. 3 separate anonymous tips reached Agent Calhoun within the first week, describing a pattern of small, casual violence the man had inflicted on animals, and, in at least one documented case 2 years earlier, on a teenage employee at the auto shop where he worked, an incident that had been quietly settled with a payoff and a signed non-disclosure agreement his own father, a respected local contractor, had arranged through a lawyer friend. Calhoun spent the better part of a week working through the county's old records with a patience that impressed even the interim officials assigned to help her, cross-referencing years of dismissed complaints against a small handful of family names that kept surfacing again and again. She interviewed the teenager from the auto shop incident, now in his early 20s and living 2 towns away, who broke down in tears describing how relieved he'd been, years earlier, simply to be believed by someone with an actual badge, since Deputy Hennertel himself had been the one who'd quietly discouraged his mother from pushing the original complaint any further. "You'd be surprised how many people just needed someone to finally ask the right question," Calhoun told Wyatt one evening, reviewing her notes at Ruth's kitchen table, while Duke dozed by the wood stove, his ribs healing steadily. "Most folks around here weren't protecting Brett Calloway out of loyalty. They were protecting the idea that nothing bad really happens in a town like this, because believing otherwise means admitting they'd been looking away from it for years." More troubling still, Agent Calhoun's inquiry into Deputy Panner's handling of the original report uncovered a pattern stretching back years. Citations reduced, reports softened, complaints quietly dropped, all clustered suspiciously around a small handful of families in Redfern Creek, whose names, it turned out, included several of Sheriff Roan's oldest friends, and in Brett Calloway's specific case, a standing arrangement in which Brett's father provided free equipment repairs for the sheriff's department vehicles in exchange for what the 2 men had, apparently long ago, come to understand, without ever needing to say it aloud, as a certain professional courtesy. It wasn't a criminal enterprise in the way Wyatt had initially feared it might be, nothing as elaborate as bribes and land conspiracies. It was something smaller and, in its own way, sadder. A town that had simply decided, one quiet compromise at a time, that certain families' comfort mattered more than the actual law, until the habit had calcified into something that looked, from the outside, exactly like corruption, because that is precisely what it had become. Sheriff Ellis Rohn sat across from Agent Calhoun in his own office 11 days after the gas station incident, watching a federal investigator lay out in patient, methodical detail exactly how thoroughly his department's quiet favoritism had unraveled under the simple pressure of an internet video, and one very determined man who refused to let the matter drop. "I want to be clear, Sheriff," Agent Calhoun said, closing her folder, "that I don't believe you personally profited from any of this. I believe you built a habit over 19 years of protecting the comfort of people you liked at the expense of people you didn't know as well. That habit has a name, and unfortunately for you, it's the same name as what actual corruption looks like from the outside." Rohn sat with that for a long moment, his hands folded on his desk, looking suddenly much older than he had 11 days earlier. "I always told myself I was just being a good neighbor," he said quietly, almost to himself, giving people the benefit of the doubt. "I never once stopped to ask who wasn't getting that same benefit." "That's usually how it starts," Calhoun said, not unkindly. "Very few corrupt systems begin with someone deciding to be corrupt. Most of them begin with someone deciding to be generous to the wrong people, over and over, until generosity and favoritism become impossible to tell apart." "What happens now?" "Deputy Panner is being formally charged with dereliction of duty and falsifying a police report," Calhoun said. "Brett Calloway and Cole Whitfield are being charged federally for cruelty toward a documented military service animal, along with state charges for the attempted intimidation at Mrs. Marsh's property. Given the pattern my office uncovered regarding your department's handling of complaints involving certain families over the years, I'd strongly recommend you consider your own position here very carefully before this goes any further than it already has." Sheriff Rohn resigned 2 weeks later, releasing a brief statement to the local paper acknowledging, in careful lawyer-approved language, that his department had fallen short of the standards this community deserves. He did not run for re-election, and he did not attend the town's small vigil for Duke, though he was seen, a few weeks later, quietly dropping off a handwritten apology at Ruth Marsh's mailbox, unsigned, which Wyatt found and read without ever mentioning it to anyone but his grandmother. Deputy Panner was quietly terminated and would go on to face his own charges in the following months. The state appointed an interim sheriff from a neighboring county, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Gail Ortiz, to oversee Redfern Creek's department while a full review of its practices got underway. Brett Calloway's trial, when it finally came in early spring, drew a crowd far larger than the tiny Redfern County courthouse had ever hosted before, reporters and animal welfare advocates filling the gallery alongside curious locals who could hardly believe their sleepy town had become, for a few strange weeks, a fixture on national news. Jury selection alone took the better part of 2 days, the prosecution and defense both working carefully through a jury pool drawn from a county where nearly everyone had, by that point, already seen the video and formed some opinion about it. Several potential jurors were dismissed outright for admitting they'd already made up their minds one way or another, and the judge, a sharp and unflappable woman named Miriam Castellano, who had been brought in from an adjacent district specifically to avoid any appearance of local bias, reminded the 12 who remained, more than once, that their duty was to weigh only the evidence presented in that room and nothing they had encountered scrolling through their phones at home. Brett's attorney, a competent but overmatched local lawyer named Harlan Boyd, tried the only strategy available to him, arguing that the incident had been a moment of poor judgment rather than a genuine pattern of cruelty, and suggesting that the viral spread of the video had inflated a minor scuffle into something far more serious than it actually was. Mr. Calloway made a terrible mistake in a moment of thoughtlessness, Boyd told the jury during his opening statement, pacing slowly in front of the box with his hands clasped behind his back. He is not the monster the internet has decided to make him. He's a young man who coaches Little League, who has never before faced so much as a parking ticket, and who deeply regrets what happened that day. I would ask you, ladies and gentlemen, not to let a viral hashtag decide this case for you before you've even heard the full story. The prosecutor, a measured, unhurried woman named Assistant District Attorney Renee Foss, offered a far shorter opening in response, one that seemed, in its plainness, to land harder than anything Boyd's careful theatrics had managed. The full story, she told the jury, is on video. You will watch a restrained animal struck repeatedly with a steel pipe, while 4 grown men either participated in the act or filmed it for their own entertainment. There is no version of that story that ends anywhere other than exactly where we are standing today. The prosecution's case, however, rested on evidence that left very little room for that kind of narrative to survive. The video itself, played in full for the jury, showed with total clarity a man raising a pipe against a restrained, defenseless animal while 3 others either participated or filmed the act for entertainment. Dr. Fenwick testified calmly and clinically about the 2 cracked ribs and the deep bruising Duke had suffered, walking the jury through X-rays that made the extent of the injury impossible to minimize. In 20 years of practice, Dr. Fenwick told the jury, her voice steady but plainly angry beneath its professional calm, I have never treated an animal injury that troubled me as much as this one. Not because the wounds themselves were the worst I've seen, but because of how deliberately they were inflicted. This wasn't an accident. This was a decision made and carried out over the course of several minutes against an animal with no ability whatsoever to defend himself. The prosecutor called Denny Ochoa next, the young man whose phone had captured the entire assault and whose cousin's decision to share it had ultimately broken the case wide open. Denny testified with visible shame, admitting under gentle but firm questioning that he had filmed the incident out of a thoughtless impulse to document something he found darkly amusing at the time, and that it was only watching the footage back, alone in his room that same night, that he'd finally understood exactly what he'd been laughing at. I keep thinking about the sound that dog made, Denny told the jury quietly. I didn't really hear it in the moment, not really, not the way I heard it afterward on the recording. I should have stopped it. I should have said something, instead of just standing there filming it like it was nothing. I'm not proud of that, and I don't think I ever will be. And when Wyatt Marsh took the stand, dressed in his formal Navy uniform at the prosecution's request, the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward as one, understanding, perhaps for the first time, exactly what kind of restraint it had taken for a man with his training to walk away from that gas station parking lot without doing considerably more damage than a twisted wrist and a shove into a tailgate. Chief Petty Officer Marsh, the prosecutor asked, can you describe for the jury what Duke means to you, beyond simply being a pet? He's a decorated veteran of 2 overseas deployments, Wyatt said, his voice steady, carrying easily through the quiet courtroom. He took shrapnel meant for me during an operation I'm not permitted to describe in detail. He never once hesitated to put himself between me and danger in 6 years of active service. I made him a promise when he retired that the rest of his life would be safer than the years he'd already given. I intend to keep that promise regardless of what it costs me to keep it. On cross-examination, Harlan Boyd made a clumsy attempt to suggest that Wyatt's own reaction in the parking lot had been disproportionate, that a trained combat veteran confronting unarmed civilians represented its own kind of danger the jury should weigh carefully. Mr. Marsh, you've spent 16 years being trained specifically in the use of force, Boyd said. Isn't it fair to say a man with your training could have caused far more serious harm to my client than a bruised chest and a sore wrist if that had been your intention? That's exactly right, Counselor, Wyatt said evenly, and the fact that it wasn't my intention is precisely the point. I was trained for 16 years to apply exactly the amount of force a situation requires, and not 1 ounce more. Your client applied a steel pipe to a restrained animal that had absolutely no ability to defend itself or escape. I'd asked the jury to consider which one of us actually demonstrated a lack of control that day. Boyd tried once more, shifting tactics. Isn't it true, Mr. Marsh, that you could have simply called the sheriff's department first, rather than intervening physically yourself? I could have, Wyatt agreed. And by the time anyone arrived, my dog would very likely have been dead. I've spent 16 years learning the difference between a situation that can wait for backup and one that can't. This was not a situation that could wait. Boyd had no further questions, and the defense rested shortly afterward, having offered the jury nothing more substantial than character references from neighbors who insisted Brett Calloway was, underneath it all, a good boy who'd simply made a mistake. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. Brett Calloway was convicted on federal charges of cruelty toward a documented military service animal, along with state charges of animal cruelty and attempted witness intimidation stemming from the incident at Ruth Marsh's property, and was sentenced to 18 months in federal custody, along with a lifetime prohibition on owning animals of any kind. Cole Whitfield received a shorter sentence of 8 months for his direct participation, while Denny Ochoa, who cooperated fully with investigators once the case moved forward, and whose cousin's decision to post the footage had ultimately broken the whole case open, received probation and a mandatory community service requirement working with the very same animal shelter that had briefly housed Duke during the investigation's early days. Judge Miriam Castellano, before adjourning the case, addressed the courtroom directly, her gaze moving slowly across the gallery packed with reporters and neighbors alike. "It troubles me deeply," she said, "that it took a viral video and a federal investigation to secure justice for an act of cruelty that several people in this community witnessed, or heard about, or quietly suspected long before any of us ever saw that footage. I would ask everyone in this room to consider how many other Dukes there might still be out there, suffering quietly in places nobody thought to look." The weeks following the trial settled over Redfern Creek, the way weather settles after a long, loud storm finally passes through. Quiet, a little battered, but unmistakably clearer than before. Interim Sheriff Gail Ortiz instituted new reporting protocols within her first month, requiring any complaint involving physical harm, human or animal, to be reviewed by a second officer before any citation could be reduced or dismissed. A small procedural change that nonetheless represented, to longtime residents, an entirely new way of thinking about how their town handled the people who lived in it. Ortiz also opened the county's old complaint files to a small independent review board, a decision that surfaced a handful of other cases that had quietly withered under the same kind of neighborly leniency that had nearly let Brett Calloway walk away with nothing more than a bruised ego and a warning. A woman named Carla Jimenez, who had reported her ex-husband's escalating harassment 3 separate times over 2 years, only to have each complaint quietly filed away without action, finally received a restraining order that actually stuck, and stopped Wyatt personally at the diner one afternoon just to thank him, though he insisted, uncomfortably, that he'd done nothing at all to help her case directly. "You didn't have to," she told him. "You just made it impossible for this town to keep pretending nothing was ever wrong here." That was enough, Doctor. Louise Fenwick's small veterinary clinic saw a noticeable uptick in community support in the months following the trial, donations arriving from strangers across the country who had followed Duke's recovery online, enough that she was finally able to build the small addition to her clinic she'd been saving toward for years, a wing she quietly named, without ever telling Wyatt directly, the Duke Recovery Room. She also started a modest low-cost program for the county's working families, funded largely by the wave of goodwill donations, ensuring that nobody in Redfern Creek would ever again have to choose between an injured animal and a grocery bill. Ruth Marsh's little property outside of town became something of an unofficial landmark for a while, strangers occasionally slowing their cars along the county road just to catch a glimpse of the famous German Shepherd, though Wyatt made sure, gently but firmly, that his grandmother's privacy and Duke's recovery both came before anyone's curiosity. Ruth, for her part, seemed to enjoy the mild local celebrity far more than either of them, baking pies for the reporters who occasionally showed up at her door and telling anyone who would listen exactly how proud she was of her grandson, though she made every single one of them promise not to print her chicken coop in the background of any photographs, on account of it needing a fresh coat of paint. Brett Calloway's father closed the auto shop within 6 months, Unable to keep enough customers to stay afloat, once word spread through the surrounding counties about both his son's conviction and his own quiet arrangement with the sheriff's department over the years, he sold the property and moved 2 states away, and nobody in Redfern Creek seemed particularly sorry to see the sign come down. Duke healed slowly but completely over the following 2 months, his ribs knitting back together the way ribs do, his limp fading a little more each week under Dr. Fenwick's careful supervision, until the day finally came when he could once again run the full length of Ruth's back pasture at a dead sprint, ears back, tail high, exactly the way he had before 4 cruel men decided he looked like an easy target. Ruth took to sitting on the back porch every evening just to watch him run, calling it, only half joking, the best television Redfern Creek had ever produced. On the morning Wyatt's medical leave finally ended, he stood on his grandmother's porch in his service uniform, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, Duke sitting calm and alert at his side despite the 2 cracked ribs that had, weeks earlier, nearly cost him far more than a long recovery. Ruth hugged her grandson tightly, the way she had done before every deployment for the last 16 years, memorizing the shape of him the way people do when they've learned never to take a goodbye for granted. "You be careful out there," she said. "Both of you." "We will, Grandma," Wyatt said. "We always are." "I mean it, Wyatt." She pulled back just enough to look him in the eye, the way she used to when he was small and prone to wandering too far down toward the creek without telling anyone. "You did something good here. Don't let anybody, out there or back here, ever convince you it wasn't worth doing." "I won't," he said, and meant it. She pressed a small paper bag into his hands before he could protest, the way she always did. A few biscuits wrapped in a dish towel, a jar of the tomato preserves she'd been making from her garden since before Wyatt was born, the kind of small, unglamorous love that had raised him just as surely as any training pipeline the Navy had ever put him through. He knelt down one last time before climbing into the truck, resting his forehead briefly against Duke's, the 2 of them sharing a quiet moment that needed no words between them, the same wordless understanding that had carried them both through 6 years of deployments and, more recently, through a Texas parking lot that had nearly ended in tragedy before it ended, instead, in something that looked very much like justice. "You did good, old man," Wyatt murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You always do." Duke leaned his heavy head into Wyatt's hand for a long moment, then pulled back, tail wagging low and steady, ready, as always, for whatever came next, simply because his handler was the one leading the way. As the truck pulled out of the long gravel driveway, past the barn where 2 frightened men had once tried and failed to leave a warning in spray paint, past the county road where a video recorded on a nervous young man's phone had accidentally changed the entire trajectory of a small town's relationship with its own police department, Wyatt glanced once in his rearview mirror at his grandmother standing on the porch, one hand raised in a wave, the Texas sun bright and steady behind her, he thought, as he pulled onto the highway that would eventually carry him back to his unit, about how strange it was that a single Tuesday afternoon errand, a tank of gas, a bottle of water, a bag of groceries for his grandmother, had turned into something that reshaped an entire community's understanding of what it owed the people, and the animals, who lived quietly within it. He hadn't set out to change anything in Redfern Creek. He had simply refused to let something wrong stay unanswered once he'd seen it with his own eyes. The same instinct that had guided every decision he'd made in 16 years of service, whether the stakes were a small Texas town or a mission half a world away, that he would never be permitted to describe to anyone outside of it. Redfern Creek would never be quite the same sleepy, unremarkable town it had been before that Tuesday afternoon, and most of the people who lived there had, by the end of it, come to understand that this was very much for the better. A town that had once quietly decided some families' comfort mattered more than the law had been forced, however reluctantly, to relearn a lesson that decent people everywhere eventually have to learn. That cruelty left unanswered simply teaches the cruel that they were right to think no one was watching, and that sometimes it only takes one quiet, determined person and one loyal dog who had already given more than anyone ever should have asked of him to prove that lesson wrong. If this story stayed with you, we'd really appreciate it if you'd share it with someone who needs the reminder that decency and courage still exist, even in the smallest, quietest corners of the country. And let us know in the comments who you found yourself rooting hardest for. Wyatt's quiet restraint, Duke's unbreakable loyalty, or Denny's decision to finally tell the truth once the video was already out there. We hope that whatever hard thing you might be facing tonight, you find someone in your corner as steady and unwavering as Wyatt was for Duke. If you believe cruelty should never get the last word, drop an amen in the comments below. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. And one more thing before you go. Which city or country are you watching this story from tonight? Determinedly at his side, refusing, despite Wyatt's soft command to stay, to let his handler walk toward potential danger without him. Brett and Cole made it as far as the edge of the gravel driveway before a porch light snapped on, and Wyatt Marsh's voice cut through the dark with the same flat, unhurried calm that had already cost them so dearly once before. "I'd stop right there if I were you," Wyatt said, stepping into the light with his phone already raised, recording. "Every camera on this property has been live for the last hour. Every step you've taken since you parked that truck down the road is already time-stamped and saved somewhere you can't reach it." Brett Calloway froze, his hand still half raised with the can of spray paint he'd brought, staring at the man on the porch and the dog beside him, a dog that, despite 2 cracked ribs, stood rigid and alert, a low growl building steadily in his chest, every instinct honed over 6 years of active service telling him exactly what kind of threat had just walked onto his handler's property. "We were just," Cole started,